This story is one I never wanted to tell. The thought of what happened is enough to drive any normal person crazy. I wish it never happened. I wish it was just an incredible nightmare that haunted my dreams. But it isn't. The reason I'm telling it is so that someone somewhere might know what really happened and they could stop it from ever happening again. If you're reading this, please read the whole thing and understand what you must do if this thing ever starts up again. Please pass this information on to anyone who might be left. It isn't just about being careful not to get infected. There are several important things to learn to ensure it doesn't happen this way again. I left this book in a safe place. I pray you found it and take the time to rest and read all that happened. It starts in the distant past. Long ago, dinosaurs were the dominant species on the planet. For countless years, they reigned over the world, having no aspirations of grandeur or greed. All they cared about on a day-to-day basis was survival. When the meteor came, there was speculation that they had died instantly, that these sudden atmospheric changes were too much for them to overcome. Other theories say that something else came with the unwelcome visitor from space, something more sinister, something that made the dinosaurs turn against each other and kill those who had survived the harsh changes wrought on the planet. The answer to this question was buried long ago, deep in layers of rock, waiting to be discovered. It rose, invisible, undetected through miles of cracks and fissures in the rock. It had laid dormant for thousands of years until the barrier was broken by unsuspecting fools. It rushed and swirled in the water that it hadn't touched in centuries. The rock that held it captive crumbled, releasing its unwitting prisoner into the life-giving liquid that flowed through, destroying rock as it went. Unrestrained, it multiplied with the bacteria in the water and grew prosperous. It would have languished there if the water hadn't been given time to settle. It would have eventually been absorbed back into the rock and encased in its prison once again. Sometimes perfect timing can be a wonderful thing that blesses those who benefit from it. Other times, perfect timing can cause destruction on a massive scale. Thousands of feet above on the surface, a lone man stood, having no idea of the danger beneath his feet and what was waiting to be unleashed on an unsuspecting world. Joe was a medium-sized man with long hair, a mustache, and beard. Not the kind that was well-groomed and neat, the kind that showed he had just stopped caring about appearances and had no time to bother trimming. It was the kind of appearance that spoke of a homeless man, or one that was always on the road. More often lately, Joe thought he wouldn't mind trading places with a homeless person. At least they don't work 18 hours a day, 7 days a week like he did. His only comfort were the paychecks. Overtime was tolerated as long as the job got done and Joe was able to do the work of both people now that his partner had quit last month. The company had compensated him for working alone and promised that they would get him a new partner soon. But Joe wasn't holding his breath. He knew they were violating a ton of rules by not having a two-man crew for safety. He also knew that even with the extra money that he was getting, they were still saving thousands by having only one man working the truck. Joe struggled with the pump's controls, eventually kicking it when they refused to respond. The pressure gauges had been rising steadily and the release valves weren't doing their job. Finally, the kick seemed to break something loose and the pressure began to stabilize. That's better," he said as though praising a pet for fetching a ball. "You keep this up and we might make it out of here in an hour or so." He stepped away from the controls and went to the cab, retrieving an egg salad sandwich from his lunchbox that he had bought at a grocery store yesterday because it was half off. He peeled the plastic wrap away from the container and grabbed the triangle of sandwich, devouring it in 3 bites. The truck usually kept him so busy that he routinely forgot to eat. Pulling out the other half of the sandwich, he leaned against the door that said, Joe and Sons, Marcellus Shale Drilling. He chuckled when he first came up with the name, seeing that he was 30 years old, unmarried, and he had no children, at least that he knew of. The company had insisted that each team come up with an original name to put on their truck. They wanted to give the impression of local workers getting local jobs, even though Joe knew that it was all a lie. There were no local workers. They all worked for a large corporation that kept them on the road going from site to site 52 weeks a year. He had once asked for a vacation and was laughed out of his supervisor's office. That was when he started looking at this job as temporary. His plan was to save enough money for a house and settle down somewhere with low cost of living, and work some low-stress, low-paid job while living off the interest from his savings. At the rate that he was currently making money, it was no more than 2 years away. He didn't mind living out of a suitcase for the realization of his dream. Perhaps someday there would be an actual Joe and Sons. As he leaned there, finishing his sandwich and dreaming of the future, suddenly the truck began to shake. He dropped the last bite of his sandwich and dashed for the controls. The pressure gauge was pegged in and the release valve wasn't responding. He wrestled and kicked and punched every lever and switch that he could think of, but this time they didn't return to normal. The threshold had been crossed and there was no going back. The ground rumbled a moment before a geyser of dirty water erupted under his feet, knocking him back. He landed hard, his head bouncing off of the ground. Sometime later, he had no idea how long, Joe woke to the horrible sight of water shooting hundreds of feet into the air. He shut off everything, trying to get the water under control. After an exhausting hour, the pressure had subsided and he was able to stop the flow. He collapsed to the ground, soaking wet, and he laid there for a few minutes to gather his energy. Pulling out his cell phone and making sure that it still worked, he sighed and then called the number of the one person he had no desire to talk to. On the third ring, his boss answered. "Hey," Joe said. "No, I'm not done yet." "Why? Because this piece of crap truck you gave me just had another malfunction." "Of course it's contained," Joe said, looking at the river of shale water running through the field towards a group of houses. "Look, just give me another truck." "Yeah, I know what to do with this one." "Of course I'll make it look like an accident. The insurance company won't pay if I don't." "And I get another bonus for not reporting this, right?" "What do you mean we'll see? Maybe I'll see if I can walk away from this truck and call the EPA." "Yeah, that sounds like a great number for a bonus. Pleasure doing business with you." Joe hung up the phone and smiled. Maybe he would be able to retire a little sooner than he thought. He tossed the phone in the truck and wiped his face with a handful of paper towel. The smell of the water was making him half sick. He couldn't wait to get to the next hotel and take a shower. Unconnecting the hoses didn't take long. He capped the pipe and made sure it was secure. Looking over the river of dirty water heading for the group of houses, he shrugged. It should be fine, he thought. I'm sure the ground will filter the water before it gets to the wells. He hopped in the truck, started it up, and headed down the road, looking for a good place to have his accident tomorrow morning. Tonight was about getting cleaned up and a good night's sleep. The water had begun to settle. It had stirred around and was about to soak back into the rock for another 1,000 years or so when suddenly, it was carried up in a wave of pressure. It rose through the layers of rock, finally exploding into the open air for the first time in several millennia. Flying hundreds of feet in the air, it came crashing down in the flow of water that ran through the field. The stream carried it toward the houses and the people living in them when a depression made a pool and it was caught. The rest of the water continued unabated toward the houses, but it was stuck. With no way of propelling itself with the rest of the water, it had no choice but to wait. Waiting was one thing that it was good at. That and reproducing once it came to the right host. The coyotes had been watching Joe for days, always waiting for a chance to exploit any weakness. The lights in the big machine kept them at bay, but they were never far and always watching. The newly formed river presented them with a welcome new watering hole. The leader approached and sniffed the water. He recoiled, not liking the scent. Something about it seemed wrong. It seemed almost instinctual, like something embedded in centuries of DNA, a warning that he couldn't explain. But in the end, thirst was thirst and water was water. The entire pack began lapping it up. It had waited a much shorter time than it had anticipated. Being pulled out of the water and into the host, it immediately began doing what it did best, reproducing. It wouldn't be long until it would pass to the next host and then the next. If it was possible, it would have been smiling. Gus Swanson was a mountain of a man. His entire life, all that he had ever wanted was to be a farmer. His father owned a farm and started teaching Gus from the time that he could toddle out of the barn behind him. Gus took to it like fish to water. He had been a good enough student, but after he had graduated, there was no talk of wasting money on college. He went to work for his father just like he had done for most of his life. When his father had passed away unexpectedly, Gus continued running the farm. He had been taught every aspect, even the business end, which was the only part that he didn't like. He had lived alone since his father's passing and was just fine with that. He wasn't an unfriendly person. He would shoot the breeze with people in town when he went to the store. But so much of the farm work is solitary work. He just became accustomed to being alone. When he was approaching 40, those who liked to talk about everyone other than themselves assumed Gus would be alone for the rest of his life. And that was when Anna Lee came to town. She had been passing through looking for work and bumped into Gus as he was coming out of the grocery store. It wasn't love at first sight. It was, I know this is the person I'll spend the rest of my life with at first sight. Within 6 months, they stood in front of a justice of the peace and swore their vows to each other. A little over a year later, he was introduced to the second love of his life, his daughter, Abilene. The three of them were the happiest family you ever saw. They doted on each other and did everything to take care of one another. When Abilene was old enough to walk, she started following her father out to the barn, and he taught her about farming. He hated it when she got old enough to go to school. He missed having his little buddy tag along with him during the farm work. But as soon as she got home every day, she would run out to the barn and help her daddy. As it goes with most small farms, they're only ever one bad crop away from bankruptcy. The big corporations are more than happy to swoop in and steal. Buy small farms and then turn around and hire the farmer to work the very land that used to be his. Gus too ran into such hard times, but instead of letting the vulture corporations take his farm, he mortgaged the house to stay afloat. It worked in the short term, but it didn't take care of the long-term problem that it could happen again at any time. When the man came around offering him money to let him dig for gas, Gus scoffed and was about to run him off, until the man told him how much money he would be getting on a monthly basis for just having a pipe in his field. Even though he had never heard of Marcellus Shale before, the money was just too good to pass up. Gus agreed to the deal and kept a sharp eye for the other shoe to drop. Well, today was the day it dropped. Gus never needed an alarm. 5 o'clock every morning he was up. Somehow, Anna Lee was always up before him. While he showered and dressed for the day, She would cook breakfast and fill his thermos with coffee. This morning he came out to a breakfast of bacon, eggs, and toast. "This smells amazing," he said, giving Annalie a hug and a kiss. "Breakfast smells good too." "Flattery will get you everywhere," she said, leaning down and giving him a kiss as she handed him his plate. He smiled as spouses do when little Abilene came bounding out to the table. "Good morning, Pumpkin," Gus said. "How'd you sleep?" "I had a dream about an alligator that was having tea with a moose," she said as Annalie brought her over a plate, and then she sat her own down beside them. "Well, that sounds interesting," Annalie said. "What happened next?" "Well, the moose told the alligator he was in the wrong dream, and then he apologized and left." "Well, that was very polite of the alligator," Gus said. "Too bad they aren't like that in real life." "Oh, what are you going to do today, Daddy?" "No, I thought I would start on that new chicken coop." "After you take care of the cows." "Well, of course, I'll feed all the animals first." "No, I mean the cows," Abilene said, pointing out the window that faced the pasture. Gus and Annalie's eyes followed where Abilene was pointing. It took a minute to see what she was talking about, but once they did, Gus sighed. "You're right, after I take care of the cows." Annalie saw the cows stuck in the deep mud, struggling to get out. "Could they hurt themselves like that?" she said. Maybe," Gus said, getting up from his half-eaten breakfast and kissing them both before heading out the door. "Good luck, Daddy," Abilene called after him. He ducked back in the door and smiled at them. Gus's luck didn't seem to be very good as he pulled on the stuck cow, trying to free it. "No, come on, Elsa, work with me," Gus said, pulling on the cow that had gotten stuck in the mud next to a large pool of water that wasn't there yesterday. He tugged, trying to help her out as she mooed in protest. Finally, she got her front foot unstuck and lurched forward. Gus lost his balance and fell into the pool, making a massive splash. He sat up and watched as the cow lumbered off. Gus Swanson was not a small man by any means, pushing 7 foot tall and 300 pounds. He was a force to be reckoned with when he wanted to be. Most times, though, he was gentle as a mouse. If anything could get under his skin, it was these cows. Farming was in his blood. As a third-generation farmer, he knew the ins and outs. Most people came to him when they needed help with their farms. It was rare that Gus needed or would ask for help from anyone else. It was just his nature not to bother anyone. He got up and shook off as much of the water as he could and then went to the barn and gathered what he needed to build a fence around the offending puddle. An hour later, his impromptu barrier stood surrounding the mud pit. "There, that ought to keep the rest of you brain surgeons out of here until it can dry up," Gus said to the group of cows around him. As if to answer, one of the cows mooed at him. Once he was finished and looked around for what had caused the puddle, the answer soon became evident. He knew that it hadn't rained for a few days and looked over at the truck tracks leading away from the eroded dirt where the river seemed to have started. He sighed. When they came to him with the idea of drilling in his field, his answer was a rather emphatic no. Like so many other times, his wife had gently reminded him that they could use the money. He packed up his tools in the back of his pickup truck and started it up. The red flashing light told him that it was time to go get some gas. He drove to the local gas station that also doubled as a truck stop due to its closeness to the interstate. It was a good place to meet and greet some of the truckers that passed through on their way to wherever they were going. As much as Gus was a quiet man, he was always up for some news of what was going on outside of Larson County. His wife told him to watch the news, but he never trusted the news. They were always pushing a certain agenda and you never heard anything good. At least with the truckers, you had a chance of something positive. When Gus walked in to pay for his gas, Bill the owner stopped him in his tracks. "Whoa," Bill said, "nobody told me." "Told you what?" Gus said. "About the herd of skunks that attacked you." "Oh, you're a real comedian, aren't you?" Gus said, rolling his eyes. Bill laughed as he took Gus's money and rung up his gas. "So what'd you get into that has my station smelling so lovely?" That dang fracking guy," Gus said. "Made a mess and then left me to clean it up." "I told you that stuff was no good," Bill said. "Leave what's underground down there." "I tell that to my bank account," Gus said. "My mortgage got caught up because of the money that fella gave me to drill." "It ain't drilling," Bill said. "Whatever, I just..." Gus stopped short and turned pale. "Hey, you alright?" "Yeah, I suddenly just feel a little under the weather." "You," Bill said. "In all the years I've known you, I don't think I've ever seen you sick." Gus tried to steady himself by leaning on the counter when he suddenly vomited all over the counter and Bill. "Christ," Bill said. Sorry about that." "You need to get your butt home," Bill said, looking at the mess that him and his counter were wearing. "I'll be all right," Gus said, looking a half shade less pale. "No, you won't," Bill said, looking red in the face. "Now, if you don't get out of here..." Gus turned and walked toward the door. He stopped and turned back to apologize again, but Bill had already gone to the restroom to clean himself up. When he got home, Annalie immediately knew something was wrong. "You look terrible and you smell terrible," she said. "Well, it's nice to see you too," Gus said weakly, collapsing on the couch. She came over and felt his head. "That feels like you have a fever," she said, and then went to the medicine cabinet and returned with a thermometer. Gus refused to open his mouth. "If you want, I can go get the other thermometer, roll you over, and take your temp that way." He sighed and opened his mouth. He pulled the blanket off the back of the couch and covered up as she took the thermometer out and examined it. 103.5, that's way too high. She found some fever medicine and gave it to him. As soon as he swallowed it, he rolled over and began to shiver. Hours later, when Abilene came home from school, she was shocked to see Gus covered up on the couch. "What's wrong with Daddy?" she said. "Oh, he isn't feeling too good," Annalise said. "Should we take him to the doctor?" "I mentioned it to him, but he doesn't want to go." "Well, should I ask him?" Annalie looked at her daughter and wondered when she had gotten so mature. "Go ahead, sweetie, maybe you can get him to listen." Abilene approached the giant form taking up the entire couch slowly. "Daddy," she said. The blanket moved a little. "Daddy," she said again, reaching her tiny hand up to nudge his shoulder. He recoiled from the touch. "Daddy, if you're really sick, then you need to go see a doctor." He made a noise that she couldn't identify. It could have been a grunt, a chuckle, or a growl. "Does that mean you'll go?" The blanket was still. "Please, I don't want anything to happen to you. What would Mommy and I do if you weren't here?" Tears formed in the corners of her eyes, threatening to spill down her cheeks. The blanket rolled over and Gus faced her. Seeing the tears in his little girl's eyes was too much. His stubborn will broke. Don't cry, baby. Let's go see the doctor together." She tried to give him a hug, but he held her back. You probably shouldn't hug me right now. The last thing that I want is for you or your mom to catch what I've got." They helped him up and out to the old truck that Gus had owned since he was 19. Old Blue, they called it. He had taken care of it, and it had returned the favor by lasting and running like a dream. Annalie helped Gus into the passenger side, surprised and concerned at how little strength he seemed to have. Once Gus was in, Abilene crawled into the middle seat and Annalie got behind the wheel. They started down the road slowly. Annalie not wanting to jar Gus around too much in his weak state. Once they got on the main road, it was smooth sailing. With only 5 miles to go to the hospital on the other side of town, both of them were hopeful that the doctor could find out what was wrong and get Gus back to his old self. Red and blue lights flashed, making the surrounding trees look like some impromptu disco. 2 police cars and 3 ambulances sat on the side of the road as the tow truck pulled the blue pickup out of the trees. Half of the cab was crushed from when it had rolled over. Once it was safely up on the side of the road, the EMTs and police moved in to see if anyone was hurt or even alive. None of them felt hopeful. After doing this for a while, they had all gotten a feel for where there would be no survivors. They opened the driver's side door and found a woman in her 30s, or what was left of her. A tree branch had gone through the windshield and crushed her chest. The young girl in the middle seat hadn't fared well either. The truck was an older one without airbags, and she looked like she hadn't been wearing a seatbelt at the time of the crash. She was bloody and bruised with debris all around her. The EMT checked for a pulse and found none. It was later determined that she had died of internal injuries. They gently removed the bodies and went around to check on the large man. Surprisingly, he was still breathing. He also was bleeding and much worse for wear, but there were no fatal injuries. He was only unconscious. They got him out, needing 3 EMTs to drag him out of the truck and strap him on a gurney. "Oh my God," the first EMT said to the second. "Have you ever seen anything like that before?" "Never. Let me go get the officer." Officer Hayden was having a problem of his own. Once the bodies were out of the truck and on gurneys, he looked them over to give his initial report of what had happened and how they had died. As he had examined past the main fatal wound on the woman, he noticed her arms had several bite marks. The pattern looked to be human teeth. They looked large, like it wasn't the girl who did it, which only laughed. "Officer," the breathless EMT said, "we need you to come look at this." "Take a look at this first," he said, indicating the bite marks. "What the heck?" the EMT said, examining them closer. "They don't look like any animal bite that I've ever seen. They look human." "I agree. What did you want to show me?" She led him around to the other side of the truck and pointed towards Gus's face. "Take a look at that." Hayden leaned close and examined Gus's face. There were raised blood vessels all over it. It looked like worms were under his skin chasing each other around. "I've never seen anything like that," he said, reaching out and touching one of the raised spots. Gus's eyes opened. Hayden recoiled. Gus's eyes were red, not bloodshot, but fully red. There was no white at all. "Sir," Hayden said, setting the shock aside and letting his training kick in. "You've been in an accident. Are you hurt?" Gus didn't take his eyes off of Hayden. He didn't look around or anywhere other than the officer. "What's your name?" Hayden said. Gus didn't reply. "Can you talk?" Gus said nothing, only stared. "We're going to take you to the hospital." Gus tried to move, but these straps held him firmly in place. For the first time, he looked somewhere other than Hayden's eyes. He looked at the straps that held him down and became agitated. "We need to have you secured for your own safety," Hayden said. Gus stopped moving and made a soft sound. "What was that? I couldn't hear you," Hayden said, leaning a little closer. Gus made another sound, causing Hayden to lean a little closer. "I didn't catch." Gus moved like lightning. He thrust his head up and grabbed Hayden's ear with his teeth. Hayden screamed as the EMTs tried to get Gus to let go. Finally, Hayden pulled hard enough to break free, but left a bite of his ear behind in Gus's mouth. Gus thrashed and growled. Spittle flew from his mouth into everyone's face. Hayden held his ear and yelled, "Get him out of here!" The EMT struggled to lift the gurney up into the ambulance, partly because of Gus's sheer size and partly because of him thrashing around. Hayden held his ear as he watched the ambulance carrying Gus rush off to the hospital, lights and siren blaring. The EMTs radioed in to tell the emergency room staff to prepare for a combative patient. The whole way there, the driver struggled to keep the ambulance on the road as Gus struggled against his restraints, throwing the ambulance back and forth as they drove. The second EMT looked back and saw the destruction that Gus had caused. Sparks flew from the machines that Gus had slammed his head against and destroyed. When they got to the ER, they were met by 2 orderlies and 2 security guards. "Why aren't you in the back with the patient?" One of the orderlies asked the EMT that hopped out of the passenger side. "You'll see, coming around to the back doors." One of these security guards nudged the other. "Maybe the victim said some mean words to her," he said with a chuckle. The EMT smiled. "This should wipe the grins off your faces," she said, opening the back door. Her intention had been to shock them with what they saw. She had no idea that Gus had broken out of one of his restraints and was well on his way to breaking out of the other. He was standing on one leg with the other still restrained. In a heartbeat, all 6 hospital personnel were in a fight for their lives. Gus clawed and spat at them as his last remaining restraint grew weaker by the minute. One of the guards pulled out his pepper spray and sprayed it at Gus. For a short moment, it looked like it might work. Gus recoiled and staggered back. The problem was the EMTs and orderlies were coughing and gagging from the spray as well, and they couldn't take advantage of the moment. The second guard pulled out his taser and tried to aim at Gus. He could barely keep his eyes open from the pepper spray, let alone aim a weapon, but that didn't stop him. It also didn't stop him from shooting one of the hooks into an orderly. Fortunately, the other hook landed on the ground and couldn't complete the circuit, so the orderly didn't get 50,000 volts surging through his body. The guard realized his mistake, changing cartridges, and wiped his eyes with the sleeve, and then fired again. This time, he managed to hit Gus on the chest, sending the massive voltage down the wires into his fevered body. He fell back on the gurney and lay still. All 6 of them looked at each other the best they could through stinging eyes, and then the guard holding the taser said, "Well, get in there and put a new strap on him." The orderlies and EMTs looked at each other and seemed like they were having a mental stare down for who would approach Gus first. "We dealt with him at the crash site," the first EMT said. "It's your turn." The orderlies reluctantly stepped into the ambulance, keeping a close eye on Gus for any movement, and got 2 more straps to restrain him. They had just finished the second one when Gus woke up. The orderly wasn't expecting it, and Gus shot up as much as his restraints would allow and bit a chunk out of the orderly's arm. He screamed and fell to the floor, mostly to get out of range of Gus's teeth. He crawled out of the ambulance and walked away. "Where are you going?" the other orderly yelled. "You take care of that psycho, I'm done," he said, walking into the hospital with blood running down his arm. The orderly looked at the rest of them. "How do we get him out?" he said. "Very carefully," the EMT driver said. They approached the gurney and unlocked the wheels and then slowly pulled it out and tried to lower it to the ground when Gus decided to lurch sideways, sending the gurney tipping onto its side. It landed with a heavy thud, causing Gus to smack his head on the pavement. They all looked at each other, wondering who would take the blame for injuring a patient. The guard still holding the taser said, "I didn't see a thing." They all nodded in mutual agreement as they tried to right the gurney while avoiding Gus's snapping teeth. They got it back upright and were able to get Gus inside the hospital without further incident. After a quick report of the incident up to this point, omitting the tumble to the ground, a nurse made a quick assessment, and he was assigned a room away from the other patients where he could be quarantined. A precaution sign was hung on the door and a guard was permanently assigned to Gus's room. Dr. Tevist was the on-duty ER doctor. He came in wearing a gown, gloves, and a mask when he attempted to assess what was wrong with Gus. More restraints were added, and finally the nurse was able to draw blood and get an IV line in his arm, as well as sensors for his vital signs. Tevis watched as his vitals showed on the screen. His temperature was elevated, as well as his heart rate and pulse. Over the next several hours, they ran every test they could think of, but nothing explained all of his symptoms, especially the extreme aggression. Tevis tried giving Gus sedatives, but they didn't work. In fact, nothing worked. None of the fever-reducing meds had lowered his temperature as much as 1/10 of a degree. Giving him IV fluids did nothing as well. They even went as far as to try ice packs and putting him in the hospital's freezer for a few minutes. Everything about Gus's condition went against modern medical knowledge. Tevis was baffled and grasping at straws. He read the police report and then went to the nurse's station to make a call. Officer Hayden had just gotten back to the station after all the cleanup at the accident site. He got a cup of coffee and sat at his desk, pulling out his notepad to start typing up his report. After the first sip of coffee, he leaned back in his chair for a moment, trying to mentally picture what had happened in that truck to make it lose control. Everything pointed to Gus attacking his wife and child, but nothing in the man's profile showed him even capable of such a thing. Witnesses painted a picture of marital bliss and family happiness. He had even heard Gus's name around the neighborhood, but never anything negative. Just a good-hearted local farmer who would give a stranger the shirt off his back if he needed it. Hayden rubbed his temples, trying to stimulate his brain to make this all make sense. He touched the bandage covering his ear and found that it was still tender. What would make such a good man turn so animalistic and brutal, he thought. His phone rang and he stared at it for a long moment. He had no desire for any more tragedies tonight. He was about to let it go to voicemail when he reluctantly answered. Officer Hayden, how can I help you? Yes, officer. My name is Martin Tevis. I'm a doctor over here at the hospital. What can I do for you, doctor? I have a patient here, Gus Swanson. The report says that you were the reporting officer at the accident. I was. What can you tell me about it? I'm not sure how much I can tell you. Well, I'm not trying to get anybody in trouble if that's what you're worried about. That's not exactly what I meant. The accident itself is a mystery. How so? Swanson's wife was driving and his daughter was in the middle seat, but they both seemed to be covered with bite marks. Bite marks? Human bite marks. You're saying this man attacked his own wife and child? It looks like it. But why? Was it a domestic dispute? Everything I've ever heard about Gus Swanson said that he would never raise a hand to his wife or child. And yet, here's evidence to the contrary. Apparently. How's he doing, by the way? Well... Or is it against some rule for me to ask? It's not that. I'm not sure how he is. The way his vital signs are, he shouldn't be alive. His temperature is so high it's literally cooking his body, and yet he's still trying to tear out of his restraints. Maybe you should give him a sedative. I have, they don't work. So, are you thinking this thing, whatever he has, could be contagious? I'm not sure. That's why I wanted to talk to you and see if there was any more information that would help me figure it out. Both ends of the phone were silent as the men contemplated what could be done. I'll tell you what, I need to swing by the Swanson place tomorrow. Would you like to ride along with me? What time? Probably around 8 in the morning. That'd be perfect. I'll be getting off shift. Pick me up at the hospital if that's okay. Fine. I'll see you then. Both men hung up and sat staring at their respective phones for a long moment, wondering if there was something bigger going on behind the scenes. At 8 a.m. the following morning, Tevis walked out of the ER entrance and saw a flash of red and blue in the ER parking lot. He walked over to the cop car and looked in the window. Officer Hayden, I presume, he said. Dr. Tevis. Call me Martin, Tevis said, extending his hand. Hayden reached out and shook it. Dell, he said. Like the computers. Actually, it's Delmas, but I prefer Dell. Dell it is, Tevis said, walking around to the other side of the car and getting in. Hayden started the car and headed down the road, announcing on the radio that he was heading to the Swanson place. So how's your patient? Hayden said. Exactly the same. He hasn't eaten or slept, his vitals are the same. Should have been dead hours ago. Did you happen to notice his eyes and the raised blood vessels? Hayden said. I did. What caused that? I have no clue. In my years as a doctor, I've never seen anything like it. Hayden drove in silence, lost in thought until they arrived at Gus's farm. He pulled up to the front door and parked. Getting out and walking up to the door, Hayden was about to knock when he remembered everyone who lived here was either dead or in the hospital. He opened the front door and walked slowly inside. Tevis followed, looking all around for anything that might give him a clue as to the cause of Gus's condition. He looked around the kitchen, opened the fridge, and looked through the trash. Hayden looked over at Tevis. What did the trash can tell you? It told me Gus was really sick before the accident. Really? There's some vomit in there. Oh, that's what I smelled when we walked in. They looked at the pictures on the wall and mantel of happy family moments together. Nothing gave any indication of how they would end up. They went through the entire house and weren't any closer to discovering why Gus was acting like an animal. Animal, Tevis thought. Didn't I hear you say that Gus was a farmer? Tevis said. Yep. Tevis headed out the back door toward the barn. He looked around at the animals that hadn't been tended to yet today. He went from one to the next, looking for any similar signs to Gus's symptoms. What are you looking for? I don't know, just anything out of the ordinary. Hayden stopped. He wasn't looking at Tevis anymore. Well, I think I may have found it, he said, looking into the pasture. Tevis followed his gaze and saw the cows in the field. Most of them were grazing like you would expect cows to do, but one of them was running around like an idiot. It was chasing the other cows and trying to bite them. Tevis and Hayden moved toward the fence to get a better look. The sight of a cow terrorizing the other cows was so ludicrous that it was mesmerizing. What does that remind you of? Hayden said. Tevis stared at the scene for a few minutes. Why aren't the others sick too? He said. Hayden saw that he was right. Only the one cow was chasing the others around. The rest of them were trying to do normal cow stuff. I don't know, he said. Maybe it got into that. Hayden pointed at the spot in the middle of the field where Gus had erected his impromptu fence to keep the cows out of the water. I need to get a sample of that, Tevis said, looking around for a shovel. You're not going in there. Do you know of another way of getting a sample? Tevis said as he found a shovel just inside the barn. Do you think it might be mad cow disease that somehow passed to a human? Well, there's only one way to find out, Tevis said. You think you could distract him for me? Cows are female, bulls are male. Sorry, Tevis said, rolling his eyes. Do you think you could distract her for me? Hayden sighed. I really hope distracting a cow is the craziest thing that I do today. All part of a day's work, Tevis said. No, it's not, Hayden said as he walked around to the opposite side of the fence. The entire time he was walking, the crazed cow kept her eye on him. Tevis snuck in between the fence and into the small fenced-off area. He quietly dug up a shovelful of the still damp mud. He held it on the shovel with his free hand and was about to climb back through the fence when he heard, "Look out!" He glanced up and the cow was running straight toward him. He jumped back inside the fence and the cow stopped before it ran him over, fence and all. It circled the small fence, making sounds that he had never heard a cow make before. It sounded like it was growling. Now would be a good time for the distraction part of the distraction, he yelled to Hayden. What do you want me to do? Distract, he said as the cow circled him. Suey, Hayden yelled. Here, girl, come on. That's a pig, not a cow. Well, what do you yell for a cow? How should I know? Come on, Jim, I'm a doctor, not a cowboy. Who the heck is Jim? Never mind. Tevis watched the cow's every move. He noticed the same redness in its eyes and the raised blood vessels on its skin. It stopped. Tevis got ready to run just in case it had grown tired of circling and was about to charge right through the fence. Suddenly it moved away. He was so surprised he just stood there watching. "Well, get your butt in gear, Mr. Distraction," Hayden yelled. "That's Dr. Distraction to you." Tevis joked as Hayden climbed through the fence and was literally running for his life as the cow turned away. Tevis climbed through the fence, carefully holding his mud on the shovel as he made his way through the field and out through the main fence. Once out, he turned and saw Hayden driving through the fence with a literal mad cow right behind him. Tevis set the shovel down and ran over to check on Hayden. "You okay?" he said. Just peachy," Hayden said, getting up and dusting himself off. "That's a nasty wound on your ear," Tevis said. "It looks new. When did you get that?" Hayden covered it. "A couple days ago," he lied. Tevis stared at him. "Well, you got your mud. Can we go now?" "Sure," he said as Hayden walked back to the car. Tevis went inside and got a plastic bag to put the mud in, and then he got in the car. The trip back was silent. Neither man said a word to the other until they were at the hospital. Tevis got out and turned back to look inside the car. Maybe you should." "Look, I told you that I hurt my ear a few days ago, so how about you drop it," Hayden said. "I was gonna say maybe you should have a vet take a look at that cow. Thanks for the ride. I'll let you know if I find anything." He walked away. Hayden opened his mouth to say something and then closed it and drove away. The new Frost Creek jail had a rocky history before it was even conceived. The old jail was so woefully out of date it would have been impossible to bring it up to code without tearing it down. Being a town that relied on its historical buildings to bring in tourist dollars, the commissioners weren't going to let that happen. Instead, they elected to build a new jail on the outskirts of town, thinking the additional benefits would be keeping the less than desirable residents at arm's length, out of sight, out of mind. The planners were given the go-ahead to draw up plans and find a contractor. When the plans were presented and the cost was announced, the commissioners pitched a fit. They insisted the developers cut costs. 3 full cell blocks got the axe, as well as the perimeter fence, motion detectors along with many security features. What resulted was a building that was barely passable as a jail. Even looking at the original blueprints, there's still a section where the 3 cell blocks exist. Comparing them to the actual building was like looking at someone who had had an arm amputated. You can see the partial hallway that was built, but it just ends with an outside door. And with any person who had such a handicap, life was more difficult. The commissioners insisted on filling the jail with anybody they could in hopes that it would bring them revenue. What many people didn't know was the full amount had already been budgeted. The money saved by cutting costs disappeared into the commissioners' pockets. Years later, the jail still struggles to meet their budget. Someone told the commissioners that you can make money with the jail, so they blamed those who work there for the loss of revenue. As with anything, you can find good people who will work for less than fair market value, even much less, mostly because they have no choice. But usually you get what you pay for, and the commissioners didn't want to pay anything. The staff at the jail was no exception to this rule. Deputy Warden Foose was a smaller man with beady eyes and a manipulative mind. He had come from a state prison under dubious circumstances. The rumor mill usually circulated conjecture as to why such a person would leave a much more lucrative position to come to this nothing town for nothing pay. Usually people chalked it up to one of 3 things: a failed relationship, an incident that was being swept under the rug, or the person was just an idiot that administration no longer wanted to deal with. In either case, the person usually came to the commissioners with glowing recommendations from the people who wanted to be rid of them. The commissioners accepted these people with open arms and bragged about how they were able to acquire people who had state training. They would leave such people in charge of discipline, training, and a myriad of other things that they should not be in charge of had the commissioners known the true nature of their departure from state. And Deputy Warden Foos was one of those people. To call him worthless was being kind. He came to Frost Creek Jail with a chip on his shoulder and an attitude about anybody who didn't immediately fawn over the plans that he had to improve the jail. Most people with any kind of common sense saw through it and recognized it as what it was. A pure narcissistic power play designed to show everybody who the boss was. He made it exactly 1 week of watching, allowing officers to show him around and show him how the jail runs before he showed his true colors. Morning briefings at the Frost Creek County Jail were usually a boring routine. The sergeant would read off updates of issues on all the blocks while the officers fought to stay awake. Today was a little different. Deputy Warden Foos stepped into the briefing room as Sergeant Thompson had just finished his morning briefing. "Is there anything you would like to add?" Thompson said to Foos. "Well, as a matter of fact, there is," he said, stepping to the podium as Thompson backed out of his way. "You people have no discipline. You have no idea of what real security is. I'm astounded that nobody has escaped from this place. Everything is lax, everybody's lazy. Each of you would be eaten alive at state." "Oh, like he was," Lycan said to Crilly out of the side of his mouth. Crilly fought to keep a straight face. "Oh, what was that?" Foos said, glaring at Lycans. "Nothing, sir." "No, I don't think it was nothing. I think it was my first official reprimand." "He was only saying how much he's looking forward to learning from somebody as knowledgeable as you," Crilly said, and then added, "Sir." Foos eyed him and then Lycans. "We'll begin a new training program this week. You will all have to study and pass a weekly test if you want to keep your jobs. And I'll be doing individual assessments personally." He glared at Lycans and Crilly. "Dismissed." The room cleared out quickly, all except for Foos and Thompson. "Would you like to give me a little more warning before you have a hissy fit on my officers?" Thompson said. "Be careful of your tone, Sergeant," Foos said. "I could do your evaluation first." "What do you think this is, the military? These people aren't here doing a tough job for the same pay they could be working at a fast food joint, and you want to come in here bellowing at them and insulting them. Who do you think you are?" Foos tried to stand a little taller despite the fact that Thompson was nearly a foot taller than him. "I think I'm your supervisor, and I think you're fired." Thompson walked straight past him towards the admin offices. "Where do you think you're going?" Foos said, having to jog to keep up with him. Without answering, he marched toward the warden's office. Foos ran and got in front of the door. "Don't knock on that door, you're fired." "I could knock with my fist," he said, shoving it in Foos's face. "Or your skull, you choose." Foos's eyes grew wide as he stepped aside. "I can bring you up on criminal charges for terroristic threats," he said as Thompson knocked. There was a moment of silence in which Foos got a smug look on his face. If the warden wasn't in, then Thompson had no one to complain to. Foos was second in command. Finally, there was a muffled, "Come in." Thompson opened the door, but Foos rushed in first. "Sir, this man is guilty of insubordination and terroristic threats," Foos said quickly before Thompson could open his mouth. "I fired him. He needs to be escorted off the premises." Warden Taylor was a large man going to seed, just entering his 60s. He had thoughtful eyes with laugh lines around them. He sat back in his chair and looked from Foos to Thompson and then to his watch. "Well, Carl, that only took you a week," the warden said. Thompson sat in the chair across from the warden and took a deep breath and then let it out. "It hasn't been easy. The straw was when he tore my people a new one at briefing." "Now just wait a minute." "Was it justified?" Taylor said, ignoring Foos. "Not in my eyes," Thompson said. "Yes, we have some problems, but they're being monitored and handled when they need to be, and in the way that they need to be. Not carpet bombing everybody for what one or two are responsible for." That sounds reasonable, Taylor said. You do know that Mr. Foos has a lot of experience. At the state level, yes, Thompson said. This is county, and you know as well as I do that we do things a little differently than they do. Yeah, I know, Taylor said. But maybe if we tried some new ideas, we could better handle our old problems. Thompson stared at him without anger or malice. Yes, sir. Foos's face beamed like a little kid that had just been handed a present. And you, Taylor said, looking at Foos. You need to calm down. This isn't state. Our people don't get paid as much and don't get as much training, and don't have to deal with such large numbers of inmates. You need to adapt to the way that we do things here, not force everyone else to adapt to yours. Foos's face fell so far that he had to pick it up off the floor. Stop trying to get people in trouble, Taylor said. Don't be some petty tyrant or you won't last here long. I understand, sir, Foos said, with a whipped puppy look. Good, now shake Mr. Thompson's hand and show him much you're looking forward to working with him. Foos reached out and gave Thompson's hand one quick shake. Great, now that we're all on the same page, we can work together for the good of the jail, Taylor said. Yes, sir, they both said without enthusiasm. Excellent, Taylor said. So, Mr. Foos, if you would return to your office, I would like to have a word with Mr. Thompson. Foos looked at Thompson and opened his mouth to say something but thought better of it. He gave a quick nod and left the room, closing the door behind him. As soon as the door closed, Thompson let out a sigh. Why did the commissioner saddle us with that clown? He said. Oh, you know how these things go. They see a title on paper and think it's a feather in their cap to hire such a person. They feel it somehow gives the jail more credibility. Pardon my French, but that's BS, Thompson said. You know as well as I do they don't care about our credibility. It's theirs they want to boost. Taylor smiled. You didn't used to be this jaded, Carl. 10 years of working for people who don't give a crap about you will do that. Yeah, I hear ya. I've only been working here 4 years and I see it. So what do I do about Bozo? Thompson said, pointing his thumb toward the deputy warden's office. You do exactly what I said. So let him run roughshod over everyone. No, just throw him a bone every now and then. Listen to his ideas and try to implement one that makes the most sense. You know he's planning on making people pass a test every week just to keep their jobs. I didn't know that, Taylor said with a grimace. I'll have a chat with him. Thompson nodded and rose, heading for the door. Carl, Taylor said. Thompson stopped and turned back to face the warden. Do you really think he's that bad? Thompson thought for a moment. I think he's going to get someone hurt, Thompson said. I hope you're wrong. So do I.